The Mormon Church runs a $265 billion hedge fund that nobody's allowed to talk about. It's called Ensign Peak Advisors. It's bigger than BlackRock's largest private fund. And in 2023, the SEC fined it for hiding its holdings behind 13 shell companies for 20 years. The church says the money is for the second coming. The whistleblower says it's for something else. So let's see how it actually works. The Mormon Church has around 17 million members. Every active member pays tithing, 10% of income, a religious requirement since 1838 that has funded chapels, missions, and universities. Standard religious spending. Then, in 1997, leadership created a new entity, not a charity, a private investment firm called Ensign Peak Advisors, operating from a Salt Lake City office. For the next 26 years, Ensign Peak didn't spend the tithing, it invested it. By 2023, the balance sheet had grown to $265 billion, and almost nobody, including most of its own members, was supposed to know. How did $265 billion stay hidden? Under US securities law, any investor managing more than $100 million in equities has to file a 13F report with the SEC every quarter. It lists their stock holdings publicly. It's how the world knows what BlackRock, Vanguard, and Berkshire Hathaway own. Ensign Peak crossed that threshold in the early 2000s and should have been filing. Instead, it did this. It created 13 separate shell LLCs. Each held a slice of the portfolio. Each filed its own 13F. None filed under the name Ensign Peak Advisors. The shell companies had names unrelated to the church: Tripod Industries, Whistle Creek Advisors, River Oaks Management. One listed a manager who, when later asked, said he'd signed some documents and didn't know what the company did. The result? No one reading public SEC filings could see that the Mormon Church controlled the world's largest private religious investment portfolio. This went on for 20 years. It fell apart in 2019. A former senior portfolio manager named David Nielsen resigned and filed a whistleblower complaint with the IRS. Attached was an internal slide deck showing the consolidated balance sheet, around $100 billion sitting in investments. Nielsen alleged two things. First, the church was violating its tax-exempt status by accumulating money instead of spending it. Second, the shell structure was designed to evade SEC disclosure. The complaint went nowhere publicly for 2 years. Then, in December 2022, the Washington Post broke the story. The SEC opened its own investigation. In February 2023, the SEC settled. The church and Ensign Peak had used the shell structure to obscure holdings. The fine, $5 million total, $5 million, against $265 billion in holdings, a penalty rate of 0.0019%, the regulatory equivalent of a parking ticket. But the fine was only the beginning, because once the holdings went public, so did a second question. What exactly is this money for? The church's official position is that this is a strategic reserve, a rainy day fund for catastrophic scenarios. Leaders point to the Great Depression, when the institution nearly went bankrupt. But critics see a different picture. Nielsen's internal documents showed $2 billion transferred from Ensign Peak between 2010 and 2014. $1.4 billion went into City Creek Center, an upscale shopping mall in downtown Salt Lake City. Another $600 million propped up Beneficial Life, a church-owned insurance company struggling in the 2008 crisis. The church responded that those funds came from investment earnings, not tithing directly. Technically true. But the underlying capital came from surplus tithing, accumulated without being spent on religious work. How much does the church spend on charity? Leadership disclosed $1.45 billion in humanitarian aid in 2024, roughly 1% of the portfolio. For comparison, most major nonprofits spend 70 to 90% of annual revenue on mission activities. Independent analysis suggests Ensign Peak could cover all projected church expenses for 30 years without collecting another dollar in tithing. Meanwhile, members continue paying 10%, many sacrificing to meet the obligation. They do it believing the money funds missionary work, temple construction, humanitarian relief, not stock portfolios holding Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. So let's follow the money. Tithing comes in $7 to $10 billion per year from 17 million members. Out of that, operating costs, humanitarian aid, and the annual transfer to Ensign Peak. Based on Nielsen's disclosures, that transfer ran $1 to $2 billion per year for most of 2 decades. Ensign Peak invests the money in public markets. Returns average 7 to 10% annually. At 8% on a $100 billion base, the fund earns $8 billion per year, often exceeding the tithing inflow itself. For the last decade, Ensign Peak has grown primarily from investment returns, not new contributions. The fund is now self-sustaining. Who benefits? In strict legal terms, nobody personally. The church is a religious nonprofit, but the institution benefits enormously. It holds reserves larger than most governments could tax or seize. This is what Nielsen's complaint flagged, not theft, accumulation. So what does this actually mean? Legally, the church is in the clear. The SEC fine is paid. The IRS investigation remains open, but whistleblower complaints take an average of 11 years to resolve. Nielsen filed in 2019. Class action lawsuits followed, arguing the church committed fraud. Courts dismissed most, ruling religious organizations have broad discretion over fund use. The legal system offered limited recourse, but the cultural impact proved more lasting. The Mormon Church is now the textbook case for how a tax-exempt religious organization can legally build a hedge fund bigger than most sovereign wealth funds, by holding, not spending, for long enough. 3 questions remain. At what size does a reserve become an endowment in perpetuity? How much of the $265 billion will ever be deployed? And if the answer is none, it's for the second coming. Does that count under US tax law as legitimate charity? The church hasn't answered. The SEC has moved on. The money keeps compounding. Next week, we're looking at how the Vatican Bank actually works. A much smaller fund, a much larger scandal, and a priest currently on trial. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And here's the question I want to leave you with. Should religious institutions be allowed to hold sovereign wealth fund-sized reserves? Tell me where the line is. This is HEW. We're just getting started.